thank you for my colleagues at the US Embassy. Sorry, my colleagues at the Political Capital for organizing the event, and last but not least, thanks a lot for Michael Weiss for being here with us. Michael is a well-known investigative journalist who has the fame of popping up at the most conflictuous places in the world. He was at Iraq and Syria when ISIS was on its top, and also he wrote a book that was it was a New York Times bestseller that was even published in Hungarian on ISIS, and it's a pretty good book. He's also the news director at the New Lines magazine, contributing editor at the Daily Beast, director of special investigation at the Free Russia Foundation, and an author of many reports. One of the reports that has become quite of a Bible of disinformation experts is a report that he wrote together with Peter Pomerantsev called Menace of Unreality. And as a disinformation expert dealing with Russia, you can fairly easily have the frustrating experience of, if you think that you came up with something original idea, then you can be sure that they have already written about that in their report. It was published back to 2014, but still pretty relevant and actual. He was also writing a report on the psychological influence operations of GRU, the Russian Military Intelligence Service, and he's writing a book right now in this topic that will come out soon. Michael is a principled voice when it comes to raising awareness about Russia's action and influence in the near abroad and also beyond. And also he paid a fair share of criticism towards Western governments as well when they were inactive or unwilling to counter the threat that the world has been facing and is facing from Russia. This is Michael's first time here in Budapest, so really glad to have him here. And I won't say anything more because I will be in the panel afterwards. Just let me outline the schedule and scenario of our meeting today. So we have scheduled it for 2 hours, and given that we are cooperating with the US Embassy now, so we decided to be rather punctual about that. And after I'm giving my initial remarks, Derek Westfall, the Deputy Chief of Mission from the US Embassy, will also say some welcoming words. Then Michael will deliver his presentations and talking about many issues that we would like to cover today, not just the war against Ukraine and disinformation, but also the image of the United States and how the war had an impact on the US political debates, and which is also pretty important because the midterms are approaching. And then my colleague Patrick Siherle, analyst at Political Capital Institute, will introduce shortly the results of a study that we have done, which is about the image of the United States in Hungary, because this is a topic that we would also like to cover, what kind of impact the war had on the image of the US. And then there will be a roundtable moderated by Enit Inotai from ARD, and also with the participation of Blanka Zöldi, the chief editor of Lakmus, the fact-checking site in Hungary, that have done a lot of work in debunking some of the lies among the many that are circulating in the Hungarian public domain on the war in Ukraine. And also we will have in the panel András Srác, who is a very well-known Russia expert from the National Public Service University. So, without further ado, I would like to pass over the floor to Derek Westfall from the US Embassy. Derek, dear DCM, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My goal here is going to be to speak as briefly as possible because we have a very interesting and an exciting panel to share with you, and I really am anxious to hear what they have to say. But I did want to very briefly thank Peter and his team for organizing this event. We really value our collaboration with Political Capital, particularly on all of these subjects, but particularly on the subject of disinformation, which we see so much tied in with the war in Ukraine now. We live in an age marked by, it seems to me, the inability of people to separate truth from fiction, or actual news from conspiracy theories. But I do wonder sometimes if this is something that has always been part of human nature. And I'll share a brief personal story. My father's name was Wendell Westphal. Now, Wendell is a bit of an unusual name in America, but he was named after Wendell Willkie, who some of you may know he was the Republican nominee for president in 1940. Against Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. And my grandmother hated Roosevelt because she had heard a rumor from her friends that Roosevelt was a secret communist, and she did not want to have anything to do with that. So, you know, that was some early pre-internet disinformation. And so, of course, she voted for Willkie and named my father Wendell after him. So maybe, I don't know, my father owed something to 1940s era disinformation, I don't know. But the difference today, of course, is that we have the internet, which is weaponized information and the spreading of information like it has never been before. Now this, of course, and when we talk about this issue in Hungary, this is not a Hungarian problem. This is a global one. And anyone who watched the last elections in the United States knows it's a problem in my country as well. And in Ukraine, despite international news coverage, thousands of heartbreaking images that are coming out of Ukraine, many people remain receptive to this information, this disinformation, that portrays Russia's actions in a positive light and somehow blames the West and the United States for the conflict. The Kremlin creates and spreads this disinformation in an attempt to confuse and overwhelm people. And sadly, it seems often that they are successful in doing this, but we shouldn't lose heart, because the simple fact is that as frustrating as it is to see social media awash in this disinformation, it is the truth expressed loudly and clearly that disarms Russia's disinformation weapons. So with that, I can just say that today's event is a small but important part of this larger effort at seeking the truth. So thank you all very much for coming. I will turn it over to Michael, and I'm excited to hear the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. Usually when I give talks on Russian influence operations, disinformation, I don't actually prepare any notes, because I find it better to have a kind of casual conversation, including the work that I've been doing for the better part of a decade now. In 2014, as Peter mentioned, I co-wrote this report, The Menace of Unreality, with Peter Pomerantsev, who's, I think, one of the most celebrated chroniclers of Putinist Russia. And at the time, I mean, we had a simple task, which was to try to excavate some of the Cold War history of active measures, Soviet disinformation schemes, put it in a contemporary context with relation to the crisis of the war, I should say, in Ukraine. So this was just immediately after the seizure and annexation of Crimea, the outbreak of the dirty war in Donbass, and we were really kind of localized in our area of study. Some of you may remember a lot of the fake news, which has now become this term of art that we all use in an international scale, but at the time, there was a story that Ukrainian defenders had crucified a young child. I think this was in Slavyansk, if I remember correctly. And depending on which Russian outlet or purveyor of disinformation you consulted, it was either a little girl, or it was a young boy, or it was an infant, or it was a toddler. But as you can imagine, it didn't take long for this to kind of catch fire in certain dark precincts of the internet and even in Russian state media. And so we wanted to kind of give a history of how these things, how the sausage gets made, as it were. And we went back and looked at everything from the original conspiracy theory that the CIA assassinated John F. Kennedy, which was a very clever Soviet active measure, given to an Italian journalist who wrote up a story, and that story worked its way all the way into the New Orleans prosecutor's office. And some of you will have imbibed this conspiracy theory in the form of Oliver Stone's blockbuster film, JFK. Most of the people in Hollywood who made that movie, or certainly the consumers of it, didn't realize that this whole thing was essentially a Soviet construct, a bit of disinformation designed to make the American electorate think that their security service was responsible for killing the president. Now, go back to that point in time, 1963. To create something like this, an international scandal, a Soviet intelligence officer will have had to have cultivated, if not recruited, a friendly journalist, in this case an Italian, provided some bit of data or information, however false it may be, to that journalist, get that journalist to publish something in what we call the dead tree press, right, print publication, have it edited, copy edited, and then put out there. Now, an Italian newspaper is not something that at the time most Americans or even, frankly, other Western Europeans would have consulted. But if it gains enough steam, if it gains enough traction, it goes viral, to use a 21st century term in the 20th century. Today, just to put it in context, how much more difficult is it to combat this stuff? You no longer have to cultivate or recruit journalists. You can simply upload something to the internet, and if it's compelling enough or seductive enough, or if it ticks all of the boxes of your ideological priors, it's something that will gain traction. It will go viral, it will have momentum, it will have people, even people who are not witting participants in a Russian disinformation scheme, pushing it out there. We've seen this most recently with respect to the intervention in the US presidential election in 2016, a Russian hack and leak operation laundered through various portals, including WikiLeaks, which, I mean, we're still debating this, what, 7, 8 years on. Did this have a tangible impact in swaying a US presidential election? So the report that Peter and I did in 2014, I think, is kind of quaint and coy and frankly outdated, because now what we're seeing is this thing has become a global phenomenon. And right now we have this debate in the United States of how best to counteract disinformation. There have been government interagency bodies created. There have been, think tanks and NGOs stood up and funded with government money to try and figure out the best way to do this. Clearly in the United States we have the Bill of Rights and there's First Amendment issues involved. But one of the most gratifying things of the last 3 months, in which there has been very little to be gratified or pleased about, is that with respect to the war in Ukraine, I think the Russians have had a very, very difficult time of getting their narrative out in any meaningful capacity. Now, caveat this with, clearly we've seen nonsense stories about the false flag attack in Mariupol. We've heard, the best thing that they did, frankly, was to pour cold water on what was a very concerted US government effort to leak the intelligence that the US and the UK in particular had compiled, suggesting that an invasion was almost certain to happen, if not inevitable. And that campaign, as we now know, in hindsight, was designed to do basically one of 2 things, or 3 things. First, and most optimistic, if not wishful of all, try to get the Russians to stop, right? Preempt Putin's war by showing we know everything he's going to do before he even does it. Number 2, get some of the more wobbly or wayward allies, particularly the French and the Germans, on board to realize the threat and to rally round. Number 3, to in real time and preemptively counteract what was going to be, as we now know, very crude but perhaps effective Russian efforts to try and create a pretext or a casus belli. So, and again, false flag terrorist attacks in Donbass, Ukrainian defenders shelling their own kindergartens, et cetera, et cetera. All of which ended up happening anyway. The Russians did not seem to care that the US was basically calling their bluff before they even made the bluff. They did it anyway. There's been a kind of scenery collapsing effect to this. The Russian narrative, and I've done a lot of reporting, not just querying Western government sources, but there have been, frankly, leaks coming from within the Russian security services about this. The GRU will acknowledge, sotto voce, that their PSYOP has been an unmitigated disaster with respect to this war. And so what we've now seen happen is Ukraine has been very successful militarily speaking. I mean, you know, it's funny. There's a real distinction between disinformation and simply misinformation or bad reporting, right? And one of the criticisms I would have of the U.S. media in the lead up to the war, and certainly at the outset of the war, was this kind of doom casting that Kyiv is going to fall within 72 hours. The juggernaut of the Russian military will be unstoppable. There's very little Ukraine can do except kind of gird their loins and prepare for the worst, right? All of these articles coming out about we're going to have to sow the field for a forthcoming Ukrainian insurgency. It's going to be guerrilla warfare. There are going to be diversionary tactics and so on and so forth. But the idea that the Ukrainian army could defend certainly its capital and prevent Putin's objective of regime change was considered a just wishful thinking, a flight of fancy. Lo and behold, the Ukrainians have done, at the tip of a bayonet, the propaganda of the deed, if you like, they have managed to counteract so much mythology, so much, frankly, I would put it even differently than that. I would say that we in the West have spent decades imbibing and assimilating Russian propaganda and Russian sort of telegraphing of their own capabilities to such an extent that we really saw Vladimir Putin as 10 feet tall. And the Ukrainians, through a war of conquest and defending their homeland, have chopped him down. And we can argue about how tall he actually is, and we can also argue about Russian gains now in Lugansk. But the bottom line is, this war has done more than, I think, with all due respect, every symposium that a think tank has organized in the last 8 years, many of which I've attended, every sort of White House press secretary comment, every New York Times op-ed. And it's paramount, therefore, it's paramount that Ukraine win the war. And it is also paramount that the West not begin to go wobbly, not begin to start losing sight. And I mean, we all have a very limited and contracted attention span. And God knows, I was in Kyiv a month ago. I took the night train from Lviv to Kyiv, and this was before a lot of the embassies had reopened. And, you know, to see Ukrainian resiliency, to see Ukrainian resolve, just contemptuous humor about the lack of capability on the Russian side, just how poorly they fought, right? The idea that this is not a real military, this is a collection of murderers, rapists, and thieves. The line I was being fed by my Ukrainian colleagues and friends in Kyiv was, Michael, we're really, really worried about the United States. And I said, what do you mean, that Washington is going to somehow stop giving you arms or you know, stop defending Ukraine? No, 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 no. We're worried that you're going to have a civil war in the United States and that your own country is going to no longer exist, given what we're seeing coming out of the American news cycle. And indeed, I mean, you know, it's kind of extraordinary. Here's a country where I put a lot of energy and a lot of emotional investment in trying to understand a conflict that at the time was very limited to a peninsula and an industrial eastern region. Now it's become engulfed in a nationwide war. And yet on the Ukrainian side, there is such a level of social cohesion, such an integrity of the population, very little daylight between what the government is doing and what civil society actors want to see happen in terms of continuing to press the war, continuing to defend Ukraine, continuing to prevail upon the West to provide the material and indeed diplomatic and rhetorical assistance necessary. Whereas in my own country, I feel like disinformation has kind of reached a fever pitch. And not just disinformation, but social atomization, polarization. The idea that there is no such thing as objective truth, everything is a narrative, everything is sort of more laundered through emotional resonance than empirical fact. And you know, for the first time, as somebody who has a career in covering international affairs and foreign policy, I look at my own country through the prism of a foreign country. In a way, I feel I better understand countries that I've been traveling to in Europe much better than I do the United States. And so this is a very roundabout way of saying, I think it's time that we all stop thinking in terms of how we can best teach or instruct smaller countries, countries that have been historically subject to occupation, colonization. I think it's time we lost that sort of condescension and started listening to some of our allies, particularly in the European East. Ukraine will now be, for generations, a tutor to the West and to NATO, frankly, on how to wage a war of defense. I think it can also be pathfinding in its ability to counteract or countermand not even just disinformation and fake news, but real influence operations, right? We have now kind of crossed the Rubicon here. It's no longer about clicks and Facebook ads and Twitter hashtags. You're seeing human intelligence being instrumentalized again. People going abroad, trying to sow discord, trying to either plant disinformation, if not recruit or cultivate sources. In Europe, I mean, I've done a lot of investigative work on Russia's seconding and, frankly, financing of the European far right, particularly in European Parliament. These are all things that, you know, I think the Ukrainians could actually be quite good moral instructors and tutors to us to figure out how to get your society in shape, how to get your own house in order, the better to kind of defend Western, whatever you want to call it, the status quo, or the liberal order, as I guess we would say. And, you know, on final thought, what the Ukrainian sort of self-estimation was in February, I mean, you know, clearly the United States and the UK got it right. There was going to be a war. The Ukrainians did not think this was going to happen, but they got it wrong for the right reason, because they genuinely thought Putin would not be stupid enough to do this, because they knew what they were capable of far better than we did. So again, I think it's, this has been a kind of teachable moment in the annals of international affairs, that, you know, a country that we had almost prematurely written the obituary of, discounted as not being capable of doing something, exceeded expectation. And for all the moral solidarity that we still exhibit toward Ukraine, frankly, the only reason that they're now getting the kind of arms that they've been asking for 8 years is because they're winning. You know, nothing succeeds like success. And this has implications for the West in grander terms. I was chatting with a friend just the other week. One of the reasons why I think Americans have so responded to this conflict, including those on the right who are being fed their own streams of disinformation, right, about why are we helping Ukraine? Maybe we should be on Putin's side. There's been a remarkable level of consensus in the American electorate about this conflict, and it's, I think, for the following reason. People who've never set foot in this country, couldn't even place it on a map, are suddenly alive to the fact that, hey, the United States not only got something right in terms of its intelligence assessment, but it's also helping somebody who's winning, who is succeeding, right? And this follows in, unfortunately, 20 years of perceptible American failures, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, etc. So there's a kind of international psychological component to this war, which is it's really allowed the West to rediscover itself in a positive way. And already we're seeing signs that that is beginning to fray, that we are losing sight of this. So all I could do in closing is to urge that don't get distracted. Don't look at the bright, shiny objects, even in your domestic cultural setting. Keep the focus on Ukraine, because this really will kind of set the pace for, I think, decades to come in terms of where the West, North America, Europe is headed. And, you know, I only hope that this country does become a member of the European community, because, as I said earlier, it's going to be a kind of a moral exemplar, I think, in many ways, not just militarily. You know, the joke in Kyiv is, we don't need to join NATO, NATO needs to join us. There's a lot of truth to that. So, anyway, thank you very much.
So, thank you all for coming. I'm just going to quickly introduce you the preliminary results of a study we did on the image of the US in Hungary. In terms of economic and defense relations, we can be rather quick in our assessment. These are regularly being depicted as really solid. The Hungarian foreign minister himself recently emphasized that US companies are a strong contributor to the Hungarian economy, and there are regular cooperative projects between the Hungarian army and the US army. However, the main problem on the political side of things is that these solid economic and defense relations are basically hidden behind a veil of political conflict. By this, I mean that the Hungarian ruling party is openly backing Donald Trump, used to openly back the Trump administration and other right-wing political figures in the US, while the Hungarian opposition is actually lining up behind the Democrats and the current US administration. So this means that there is a very real threat of political relations with the US in Hungary becoming a partisan issue. So the political divisions in Hungary are also reflected in how people are assessing the United States. If we take a look at public opinion polls, we can see, for instance, from a recent Median poll, that the majority, if they had to pick between cooperating with the US or Russia, if they had to pick, they would pick the US. However, these polls have been published fairly regularly in 2015, 2018, and 2022. We are seeing a decreasing trend in the proportion of people who would side with the United States. And in 2022, there was only a relative minority who would back the US. And the views on the United States are strongly depending on party politics. For instance, in 2022, in the Median poll I mentioned, 82% of opposition voters said that they would side with the United States, but only 24% of Fidesz voters did so. And another important bit of information is that 43% of undecided voters could not pick a side. So that is a relatively big body of Hungarian people who could potentially be influenced in some way or another. Also from a Median poll, we can see that, for instance, when people had to assess Donald Trump, Fidesz voters gave him 56 points out of 100, while opposition voters gave him 22, while in the case of Joe Biden, it was almost the exact opposite. Fidesz voters were very negative about him, while opposition voters were much more positive. To return to good news for a bit, the Globsec Trends 2022 survey said that 70% of Hungarian respondents see the US as a traditional partner and ally within NATO. However, when they were asked about more general bilateral relations, they were asked what great powers they see as strategic partners. Only 13% picked the US, as opposed to 35% who picked Russia and 58% who picked Germany. So we also conducted a sort of media analysis about how the US was depicted in Hungarian media in the past year, and we basically created a word cloud of the most frequently the words that are most frequently shown together with the word American. And as you can see that America regularly comes up in the context of Russia, Ukraine, Joe Biden, or the West, and even China is on there, and the war is on there as well. So the US is mostly depicted in the context of Russia or Ukraine, so the image of the US has become inseparable in a sense from Russian and Hungarian media, which is problematic in the sense that there is a very strong pro-Kremlin layer of Hungarian society, and this might, reinforce their image of the US and Russia essentially sort of being the exact opposite of each other. So overall, we saw more articles that are negative about the US, but the picture is not this clear. So for instance, pro-government media is very critical of Democrats and the current US administration, but they are writing rather positively about the Trump administration or right-wing political figures in the US, while the independent press, for instance, was more critical of the Trump administration. Although here I must note that being critical can be very different things. You can be critical in a balanced manner, and you can be critical by spreading manipulative information, for instance, about the, let's say, perceived suitability for office of some democratic officials. We can also talk about sort of gray zone media, which we define as media outlets who are openly backing one political side or another without any sort of official connection to them, and alternative pro-Kremlin sites. Well, these used to be the main sources of anti-US disinformation before the war, except for some gray zone outlets who are backing the opposition, who are very enthusiastic about the United States, except for the Trump administration. So at the start of the Russian invasion brought some change in this regard. More anti-US conspiracy theories showed up in some mainstream media outlets, for instance, about the US allegedly trying to start a war between Europe and Russia. The pro-Kremlin alternative sites, or well, one site in particular, became much more popular, so more people are being reached by these anti-US disinformation narratives, and the gray zone media also took sides very clearly. Pro-government ones, well, they either continued with the government's peace related messaging, or they clearly started to condone the Kremlin's actions, while pro-opposition gray zone outlets were very critical of the Kremlin. We also checked how grassroots discussions on Facebook in comments depicted the US, and just an interesting bit of information, we checked how many times Donald Trump and Joe Biden was mentioned by these comments since July 2020. And as you can see, the sort of popularity of the two in the comments basically followed each other throughout this period. Although people seem to be more interested in Donald Trump during the US presidential elections and during the events in January 2021, Joe Biden only had a majority in terms of mentions in Facebook comments from February this year. In terms of the words that were mentioned most frequently together with Joe Biden or Donald Trump, well, on my left-hand side, you can see Joe Biden's word cloud. The main word mentioned together with him was Donald Trump. And in the case of Donald Trump, it was Joe Biden, which also shows that grassroots discussions are also very much influenced by this sort of party political approach to the United States. So, and one very important thing we have to mention, we also checked for what we call inauthentic online behavior, which you would colloquially call trolling or online trolling. This basically involves the same comment being copied and pasted under the Facebook posts of Facebook sites regularly, at least 100 times. And since the beginning of the war, we saw 4 narratives, US-related narratives, being spread this way. The first was that the US is turning a blind eye, or has been turning a blind eye, to the genocide committed by Kiev in the Donbass. The second was that the US wanted to construct a NATO base in Crimea. The third one was that there are US officers fighting in Ukraine. And the fourth one was about this theory of United States-run biolaboratories or biological laboratories in Ukraine. And the main concern about this sort of inauthentic behavior for us is that these are being copied and pasted under Facebook posts mainly by mainstream media outlets on Facebook. So it might find followers who otherwise would not meet such narratives because they are not following pro-Kremlin sites or gray zone websites. They are following mainstream media for factual news, and now they are seeing these sort of narratives out in the open. And this is what I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention, and now I want to give the floor to Edith Inotai, who is going to moderate our panel.
Good afternoon. I would encourage all the panelists to take from the second row. It doesn't work? We have a technical problem because the translators are not hearing us. Could anybody help us? Does it work now? Yes, perfect. So we cleared all the technical problems. So we will start the second half of this conference, which is a panel discussion about various topics. It's the US position, the US in the disinformation campaign of Russia, the war in Ukraine, and disinformation itself in Hungary, which is, I think, a major, major issue. Let me first introduce the speakers of the panel. Blanka Zöldi, who is the editor-in-chief of Lakmus, an important fact-checking news site. Michael Weiss, Peter already introduced Michael. I would just like to add that, as far as I know, he's currently working on his third book on psychological warfare conducted by the Russian Military Intelligence Center. That would be also an interesting topic if you can share any details about that. Peter Kreko, director of Political Capital Institute and senior fellow of the Center for European Policy Analysis, and András Rácz, Senior Research Fellow of the Center for Strategic and Defense Studies at the National University of Public Service. And my name is Edith Inatai, and I will moderate this discussion. We are running pretty well with time, but thanks to the previous speakers. But we plan to have a discussion about like 45-50 minutes, and then give you the opportunity to ask questions. So let's start. I would like to pose the first question to Blanka Zöldi about disinformation in the media in Hungary concerning the war in Ukraine. What are the most astonishing patterns of disinformation you have encountered lately? And what can the media and the journalist do when he or she sees these patterns? It's not very easy to figure out that we are talking about disinformation. You can't be on the ground all the time to check that. So what are those patterns, and what is your approach?
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, we have been covering with our fact-checking website the Ukraine war quite intensely. This is a quite new area for us, honestly, because we have just launched our fact-checking website like half a year ago, so this is deep water to start with the war. But first of all, I think we need to understand that Hungary has been in a special place, actually, at the start of the war, because we have seen the past 12 years of the government building a very friendly relationship on the one hand with Russia, trying to persuade Hungarians about the benefits of this relationship. On the other hand, also tightening the grip of Hungarian independent media. And at the same time, we also had Hungarian elections coming up. We were just in the middle of the election campaign when the war broke out. And basically, the election was portrayed as a matter of war or peace in Hungary. So misinformation and disinformation kind of flourished in this environment. Regarding the narratives that we have seen in Hungary, I have to say that they are not very different from what we see globally, actually, and what we have seen in the speeches of Putin. In Hungary, actually, the interesting aspect is that these narratives are not primarily spread in fringe Facebook groups, but actually by the highest levels of politicians and by the pro-government mainstream media. So this is the very big issue that we are facing as fact checkers, that we don't have to dig deep into Facebook groups, but actually turn on public television to see false information spread. And regarding actually the interesting discourse that is being born actually right now. I was listening with great interest to Michael's presentation about what you said about the polarization in the US, and also actually the problem arising from misinformation, that in Hungary actually what we see that there's a problem that people just don't believe anything. Facts are just, you know, portrayed as different opinions. One side is also spreading misinformation as the other side regarding the war. And in this type of environment, actually, journalists and us fact-checkers are becoming targets of actual attacks, just because of pointing out that something is in line with Russia's narrative or straight out misinformation, disinformation. Like most recently, we had this issue, actually, like a right-wing, a far-right party who has just got into the parliament, Mi Hazánk. We wrote about their activities and the narratives that they're using, which are very much in line with Putin's narratives. And in response, instead of providing a proper answer to journalists, the leader of the party went out straight to the US embassy, shooting a video of himself, saying that, well, it's no wonder that the journalists are asking these type of questions, because we know whose interest it is to portray me as such, and we have launched an attack against him. So in this sense, I think the very big problem that we face currently in Hungary is the very nature of believing or not the facts themselves, and to navigate in this information space.
Thank you very much. We will get back a little bit to the media, I think, later on, and how well prepared is the media to tackle disinformation. But I would turn over to Michael and ask him, how is the war in Ukraine seen right now from the US, and to what extent is it becoming a domestic issue? Could it have any impact on the upcoming midterm elections?
Thank you. Look, fortunately, I think a broad swath of the American electorate, as I said before, both on the left and the right, tend to be pro-Ukraine. The problem is, you know, when I got back from Kyiv last month, we had the Academy Awards. And you may recall there was this big sort of push to get Zelensky to address the Oscars because it has a international viewership of hundreds of millions or whatever it is, and that ultimately didn't end up happening. What ended up happening was the winner of the best Oscar that year, Will Smith, smacked Chris Rock in the face. And I remember seeing this and first of all thinking, is this some kind of staged event? And then the second thought I had was, oh Christ, that's going to be at least 3 or 4 days of an American news cycle that's not paying attention to Ukraine, and it's going to be just obsessed with some Hollywood nonsense antic. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. And, you know, look, I don't expect the average American to spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as I do, trying to track every little bit of battlefield changes or granular detail coming out of this conflict. And clearly, you've seen now a spate of mass shootings in the United States, which is preoccupying the domestic political landscape there. Broadly, I think there is a kind of solidarity that is endured. And fortunately, I would say this administration has taken the decision to more or less start to deliver all of the weapon systems that the Ukrainians have asked for. And indeed, we're asking for 8 years ago. And as I said before, the reason they're getting it is not because the US stands with Ukraine, although it does. They're getting it because they didn't lose the war. They were winning the war. Already you're beginning to see, though, the narrative in the media shift. You know, one of the things I find fascinating is actors in the US who have very big platforms on social media, who, shall we say, take a very anti-Russia perspective, if not a nakedly pro-Russian perspective. To them, they think that the entirety of the so-called mainstream media was gaslighting everybody and, you know, sort of focusing on Ukrainian propaganda, you know, Ukrainian pluck and resiliency and fending off this war of conquest and all that. From my perspective, it's the opposite. I mean, again, February 24th, if you were alive to what was happening and you turned on the television or you opened the front page of the New York Times, you genuinely believed that Kyiv would fall, that Zelensky would be assassinated, if not captured and paraded on Russian state TV. Ukraine would cease to exist as a sovereign nation. The Ukrainians defied those expectations, and it took a while, frankly, for the American news cycle to really catch up to facts on the ground. There was a prevailing narrative, one that was inculcated, I think, by, you know, I said before, the US got it right in terms of predicting the war. What it didn't get right, meaning the military analytical community and the intelligence community, was how the war was going to go. And, you know, we're beginning to see some reporting come out now that the US played an integral part, not just in terms of security assistance that was known, such as providing javelins and, you know, rifles and ammunition, but intelligence sharing assistance, including basically instructing the Ukrainians where to remove their air defense systems, telling them, you know, Russian transport planes were coming to X location. We still don't know the full extent of what the US was doing. My guess is quite a lot behind the scenes. And all of that to the greater good. But this idea that, you know, somehow the Western media was in the tank for Ukraine, objectively speaking, just wasn't true. Again, we were predicting Russia taking their own propaganda at face value that they were going to just completely destroy this country. And now you're beginning to see the narrative, you know, after having corrected for that, the pendulum swings back. So because Russia is getting incremental gains in Lugansk, because they're putting in all this firepower and manpower in the east, and Zelensky himself has come out and said we're losing up to 50 soldiers a day and hundreds more are being wounded and we're outgunned and outnumbered. The narrative shifts back to, you know, Russia is steadily increasing or solidifying its gains and all the rest of it. Look, I'm headed to Ukraine after this. So I don't really trust what I read in the newspaper. I like to see it with my own eyes. And I think probably that the perception, again, does not match the factual reality. I also know for a fact, and the Ukrainians were very good at this, they would often broadcast losses or signal or telegraph setbacks in order to basically solicit more help from the West. They're not doing as badly as they say. Or that has been my experience in covering it in the last few months. And that's a very clever thing to do. I mean, that's good strategic communications. So, I mean, but my concern dovetails with yours, which is, and again, you know, I fear more for my country than I do for Ukraine at this point. I don't know the way the next presidential election is going to go. I have a hypothesis about how the midterm elections are going to go. The Republican Party institutionally, to a large degree, is still very much on board with supporting NATO, supporting Ukraine, but there is a vanguard rising in the party, and I know you're not supposed to get party political beyond the boundaries of your own country, but I can't help it, I'm a journalist, which is frankly batshit insane, you know, and people who are actively pro-Putin and saying so in a fashion that would be incomprehensible 5 years ago. And, you know, they don't seem, you know, this is the problem. Fact-checking, debunking lies, showing how the provenance of a disinformation scheme works, as you mentioned, saying that this is actually, it dovetails too perfectly with the Russian or the Kremlin narrative, and therefore we have to be suspect that perhaps this is some kind of active measure, or this is a story that's been planted, automatically now is met with accusations of McCarthyism, or, you know, you're working for the CIA, or you're working for the State Department. And look, a lot of this is a function of overreach on the part of Americans who, rightly so, in 2016 saw that there was a bold interference operation in American democracy waged by a hostile foreign power. The success of that campaign is still debated to this day. There were people who legitimately spent 5 years of their life turning on CNN and MSNBC, believing, because pundits were sort of signaling this, that the President of the United States would be frog-marched out of the Oval Office in handcuffs by Robert Mueller himself, and that there was going to be this massive unveiling of, you know, the biggest Russian conspiracy, frankly, ever, even outmatching that of the Cold War. And, you know, I'm writing a book on the GRU, and I'm writing a book on Russian Soviet intelligence writ large, And I have to say, it doesn't work that way. And it's never worked that way. These things, they operate in a gray zone. They're a little more subtle. They're a little more nuanced and complicated. And, you know, it is all to the greater benefit of the Russian government when we start to debate the impact the Russian government has had on our political system, if not on our culture and on our society. And again, one of the reasons I think that we overestimated Putin's capability, and one of the reasons why I'm so gratified that Ukraine has now shown the reality of that capability, is we spent you know, the better part of a presidential administration talking about how this man in the Kremlin was basically in control of broad swaths of the American government. I think there was a bit of an overcorrection, and we're paying the price for this now. You know, people come to me and they say, "You wrote this report in 2014 on disinformation. You know, don't you applaud the idea that the U.S. government is creating a board to study disinformation by the Department of Homeland Security?" Frankly, no, I'm not. I don't think the U.S. government should wade into domestic politics and try to fact-check domestic media institutions, because that has the opposite of the intended effect. It makes those institutions feel victimized, they turn themselves into martyrs, and they scream bloody murder, and they become, in a way, cult heroes. They become icons, even when they are completely and utterly full of it, and they're lying. If not because they genuinely believe it out of ideological zealotry, or perhaps, you know, they're on some nefarious payroll. So we have to be very careful, I think, about how we counteract this stuff. And look, I don't have the answers. I'm sorry to say. You know, I can make a diagnosis, but in terms of the prescription, I really don't know. I don't recognize my country anymore. And perhaps I never really understood or recognized it. I just thought I did. I work in the media. I've been on television. I write articles. Everything that I write, I open up social media, and, you know, there's a cascade of people who are, you know, they've either pulled some photograph of me from Facebook from 10 years ago, or, you know, it has a psychologically degrading effect. It's very difficult to be a journalist these days, much less to be a journalist who, I mean, I kind of marry investigative reporting with commentary, and I make no claims that I don't have an opinion. You all know what my opinion is based on what I'm saying here today. But it's a very unforgiving and horrible experience, frankly, to try and get at the truth. And it's especially so because nobody, as I said, nobody has a consensus of what the truth is anymore. You know, you can say the sky is blue, and you're going to find, you know, a goodly proportion of the American electorate that says, just because you said the sky is blue, I think it's green. And so I'm actually, it's amazing to me that there has been this kind of cohesion in support for Ukraine. I would never have guessed it in a million years, and perhaps I underestimate my own country.
You mentioned it's difficult to be a journalist. Well, let's see if it's easier to be an expert. András, how important is the U.S. role at the moment in Ukraine, and would have Ukraine stood with where it is right now without U.S. weapons? And what's your take on possible scenarios? Let's look at the facts on the ground, if there are any.
Nice and easy, thank you. Just I can answer shortly, right? So thank you for the attention and for getting me here. Of course, everything what I say here constitutes solely and exclusively my own personal opinion, so shall not be regarded as an official position of any institution, organization, or anything else. When it comes to the importance of U.S. assistance to Ukraine, it's important to see that it didn't start in 2022. It didn't even start in 2014. This has been a gradual process, which of course got a lot of momentum after 2014, and the subsequent US administrations have gradually upgraded military assistance provided to Ukraine. But this is not something that just started at the night of 24th of February this year. This has been a much longer story. Gradual assisting the reform of the Ukrainian armed forces, and for example, the performance on the operational and tactical level, which we see from the Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, training and expertise provided by the US through all the 8 years of the war, it has played an important role in that. So I find it kind of interesting from the Russian disinformation perspective that they suddenly noticed that the US is supporting Ukraine militarily. Gee, it's been doing it for 8 years. But still, now it's suddenly in the news. Russians are a bit late, but it's all right. It's only 8 years. By Russian standards, it's a normal delay. And of course, when it comes to the present war, even before the 24th of February, US has been providing Ukraine with very valuable intelligence. So intelligence sharing went to basically the maximum possible level. And there are technicalities which regulate how far you can go in terms of intelligence sharing. I mean, US actionable intelligence in the very night of the 23rd or 24th February helped Ukraine's air defense and air force to survive, because they could avoid most of the initial Russian strikes. This is already public. So there has been very, very valuable intelligence provided even before, of course, 24th of February. And since then, we see a gradual increase in the amount and also depth of information shared with the Ukrainians. So this is, if we kind of categorize assistance, a classic way, like military, economic, informational, political, all are essential, but probably in Ukraine's immediate survival after the war broke out, probably the informational one was the most important. In those first crucial 48 or 72 hours. And since then, of course, this has been getting gradually upgraded, and the US is among the very few Western countries which has been consistently supplying Ukraine also with armaments already for years. So the US has the routine and the experience how to ship arms to Ukraine, how to train the Ukrainians, how to operate in Ukraine as an operational environment. So this is all something that has been gradually built up by the subsequent US administrations. And of course, there have been changes depending on which administration was on power. I mean, during the Obama administration, a bit of simplification, of course, but during the Obama administration, the narrative was, let's not deliver advanced weapons because it might lead to escalation. During the Trump administration, Javelin missiles were already delivered, but the story was that, okay, let's deliver the Javelins, let's train the Ukrainians, but let's not send the Javelin to the front line, because it might lead to escalation, it might lead to some Javelins falling into the wrong hand, and it might lead to some untrained Ukrainians firing an $80,000 missile on a $500 all it was. That's just not economical enough. And after the Trump and with the Trump administration, it started that now with the Biden administration, yes, weapons are delivered to Ukraine, have been delivered to Ukraine, and have been delivered to the front line and put in action as well, even before the 24th of February. So this is a gradual process. And because of this process has lasted so long, the US has a lot of advantage of knowing the environment, knowing the Ukrainians, and having the trust from the Ukrainian side. So I would say this information and also military assistance is of essential importance. And particularly since December last year, since the US started this very unique practice of actually sharing a lot of intelligence about Russia's plans, and most of this shared intelligence turned out to be breathtakingly accurate, even on the level of like divisions and Russian brigades moving. This kind of intelligence sharing and the credibility gained through this intelligence sharing, I think it also played a role and has been playing a role in forging the coalition to support Ukraine. Because in many European countries, it has not been evident on day one that Ukraine would deserve full support. There were some European countries which adopted, no, let's wait and see whether Ukraine survives the first few days of the war. And US effort in forging this diplomatic coalition behind Ukraine has been of essential importance. And the fourth one, which is probably not essential for the immediate survival, but is essential for the sustainability of Ukraine as a functioning state, dear colleagues, economic assistance, economic and financial assistance. We're talking here about lots of money, both on bilateral basis and also in multilateral frameworks. So, and this is going to continue, of course. And when the war comes to an end, because every war comes to an end, the US will play probably a key role in also accumulating the funds necessary for the reconstruction and rebuilding of Ukraine. So to give a short answer to your question after kind of a long introduction, one word: essential. really essential. And of course, I mean, as a researcher, you cannot really double check it. What would have happened had the US not supported Ukraine? I mean, there is no way to prove it. My uninformed guess is that essential literally means essential from the sense of survival. Thanks.
Before giving the word to Peter, I just want to ask one very short question. You're saying it was essential that the U.S. is giving assistance, and this is a question to Michael and to you. Does this mean that the U.S. is actually part of this war? Can we say that?
I think it's certainly an integral part of the war, yes. Now, legally, this is the problem, and this comes to your point about sort of the vagaries of security assistance. You know, how far is too much? Intelligence sharing goes to a very high level, but there were several pieces that came out, one in NBC, that the sinking of the Moskva, which is one of the sort of the seismic events of this war so far, was done with U.S. intelligence coordination. And the White House's response was to dial it back and say, no, 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 we didn't tell them, there's the Moskva, go take it out. We just confirmed the position of a ship in the Black Sea, that kind of thing. Look, you ask anybody coming out of DOD and the CIA, particularly if you get a drink or two in them, and they'll say the real problem with our government and the reason we can't do the things we want to do is the lawyers, right? The lawyers put these sort of stopgaps on everything. Javelins, don't bring them to the front. There is a reason right now that you're seeing things go up in smoke in areas that have long been held by the Russians and the so-called separatists in occupied territories. The reason is Ukrainians have had the capability to strike in these areas. They have a very good intelligence gathering mechanism, including foreign intelligence. I mean, look at all the sorties that the Ukrainians have run into Belgorod. They sent a Bayraktar drone in to blow up fuel depots. I still don't know how all of these buildings are going up in flames in Russia all of a sudden, now that the war has broken out. We don't know the answer to that. But I can tell you, and I mean, I'm working on a story right now. Going back several years, there was instructions handed down by Washington to Kyiv: do not do anything inside Russian Federation territory, and do not do anything that could escalate the war, because there's going to be a huge inconvenience for the United States. Now, this is where I get very critical of my own government, because, you know, our sort of party line is we do not interfere in the sovereign activities of other nations, including democratic allies or partners such as Ukraine. But that's also not really true, particularly when the United States is a patron, a military patron, a security patron, a diplomatic patron of a smaller country that is vulnerable to attack. It happens all the time. And, you know, we can litigate or relitigate should things like multiple launch rocket systems or HIMARS have been given to Ukraine before February 24th. I would argue they probably should have. We can also discuss these distinctions without a difference about don't use these, we're not going to provide rocket systems or artillery systems that could strike inside Russian Federation territory. I still don't understand what that means, because if you put one up to the border of Ukraine and Russia, if it goes 50 miles versus 100 miles, it doesn't matter, you're still going to strike inside Russian Federation territory. Again, this is where the lawyers get involved. Look, right now my focus is on the present and the future, not so much the past, which is probably bad for a historian to say, but there, I've said it. I'm interested in what do they need, and more to the point, what can they exhibit that they can use to great effect. There's a reason you're seeing videos of M777 howitzer systems with Ukrainians who basically went through a crash course of training on how to use them, already operating them with very high proficiency, if not expertise. They are committed. They don't want to take lunch breaks. They want to just give us the weapons. We'll learn how to use them, and we want to take the fight to the Russians. So, molodets. I mean, like I say, keep going, carry on. There is no question, though, without the United States support, I mean, counterfactually, could Kyiv have stood? Maybe. But no, I mean, you know, we are absolutely in this conflict. And you know, but the good news is everything the Russians have said they were going to do, or everything they've kind of telegraphed, threats of nuclear war, World War III, escalation, hitting American-provided weapon systems, there is not one shred of evidence to date, and we're now going into month 4 of this conflict, that the Russians have struck one bit of Western military assistance headed to Ukraine. And I've driven the road system that they use, for instance, to drive Turkish drones with police escorts with sirens blaring. That's how important these cargoes are, and the Russians still can't hit it. So I would say that the U.S. is slowly but surely learning that there are a lot of bluffs that can be called on Mr. Putin, including, by the way, this whole thing was about NATO expansion. Ask the Finns and the Swedes. Have you been invaded by little green men yet? The Finns cannot believe that the Russians have been so quiet. Absolutely cannot believe it. They were expecting a massive campaign of active measures, disinformation, protests in the streets, none of it, crickets. And Putin himself has said we have no problem with it. 850 miles of Russian border is now NATO border. He has no problem with it. What does that do to all of the arguments preceding this outbreak that this all had to do with NATO expansion over the last 30 years? It's nonsense.
Let's go to Peter and let's talk about narratives. We have talked about the war on the ground, but there is obviously a war of narratives going on. Is this war in Ukraine in any way different of any previous wars, or this is just our perception because we are flooded with information from social media? And who is winning the war of narratives?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. I think this war is, of course, different in the sense that if we take a look at the previous conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the West, you always had a very loud and very influential wave of narrative in the West that, okay, it's just don't poke the bear, don't provoke Russia, don't overblow things. And it's like we disinformation experts had a very hard time persuading people for a long time that this is something essential and important. And right now everyone see that it's important, but there was a very strong relativizing camp in the overall Western world. And also the governments themselves were rather, how to say, rather quite inactive in trying to responding. And I can just remember that the dominant narrative, even after the 2014, so after the annexation of Crimea, was that, okay, stop talking that much about disinformation in the West and what to do about that. You are not censors. Do you want an Orwellian state that just fights disinformation? Freedom of speech is a must, and so on. So, and we don't really hear these voices anymore, because I think the general notion that information can be used as a weapon that has zero connection to anything that is connected to freedom of speech, I think it's becoming a common sense, and it's good. One thing. The other thing, so the response is much more obvious, I think, from the official level in the Western world, but also from the social level. Of course, we have this relativizing camp still, and I will talk a bit about that, but I think it's already a big achievement. One other big difference is that I think Russia has been much more successful in the last decades, let's say so, or 2 decades, to push its narrative in the West that it is right now. So if we just take a look at the polls of, let's say, Pew Research, of Eurobarometer, and so on, we can say, of course, there are differences between nations, but I mean, if we take a look at the Western world as a whole, then we can see that pro-Ukrainian, Russian critical narratives are dominating. And the poll that Patrick have just quoted, even from Hungary, shows that the popularity of Putin have declined very dramatically. According to the poll that was published in Telex recently, George Soros is more popular right now in Hungary than Vladimir Putin. And this is, I mean, can we say that Russian disinformation makes a huge success even in Hungary? I'm not sure. And of course, we experts and fact checkers and so on, I mean, we are living in the world where this disinformation totally surrounds us. And of course, you can hear it in the streets, you can hear it from official statements and so on. So I don't want to downplay the importance of the problem, but I think so far so good. What I'm more afraid of is that I'm not an economic reductionist, so I don't think that when the sanctions and economic problems here start to bite, they are already biting, but when they will bite even more, huge inflation of food products, huge inflation of energy, and so on. And governments start to, let's say, governments will be unable to put all these, I mean, to take away all the burdens from the citizens. Then this relativist voice in the European politics, some of it, most of it comes from the populist left and the populist right, but some of it comes from the mainstream as well. That okay, it's not our war, it's the war of Russia and the United States, which is pretty, I mean, a widespread narrative, not just in Hungary, all over Europe. You can hear it in Italy, you can hear it in Germany, you can hear it in France, and so on. So these voices will be louder, and probably the demand for such narratives will be higher, because the longer the war lasts, and the more brutal it's becoming, and the more it has an impact on food shortages and so on, the more people will say that, okay, it's not my war anymore, and let's focus on how to support the population here in the country, not support Ukraine anymore. We did our fair share of supporting Ukraine already, and also we see increasingly that there is a war fatigue, and that's, I mean, one of the reasons of the UN today is that let's don't forget that there is a war going on in Ukraine, but there will be a war fatigue, more and more people turning away from the deadly scenes and want some more calm period and talk and deal about other things. And what I expect is that there will be more calls for let's focus more on domestic issues instead of just supporting Ukraine. And what I expect is that the voices from the political scene that are amplifying this message will be louder as well and more successful. And what I would, what I think would be pretty important is to make it blatantly clear for everyone in every country that the main reason for the economic shortages and food shortages is that Russia started a war against Ukraine, and not the Brussels not Brussels that imposed the sanctions, not the United States that provides help for a country that is brutally attacked, but it's Russia itself, and NATO, European Union, and all the Western countries that providing help are try to save the European population, not they are attacking. And a very last thought is that there is also we can see it in the social media and everywhere. There is this emerging narrative that liberals are imposing this moral obligation to us that let's defend Ukraine and let's stand out for Ukraine. Why they are doing that? And it's utterly, and it's emerging on the conservative side, and it cannot be further from reality. I mean, for example, in the European Union, which is the country that is probably the most supportive towards Ukraine, one of the most supportive, it's Poland, and you can blame the Polish government with anything except that they are liberals. Let's take a look at Boris Johnson's government, how liberal it is, and so I think it goes beyond party lines, but there will be, I think, an increasing attempt to politicize this issue and translate it into party politics in the United States and in the European Union as well.
Well, we are perfect with time, so there is still a chance for a last round before we open up for questions. Just an overall question for everybody in the panel, but perhaps to Blanka first. What are the sources we can still trust? I mean, as a journalist, are there any sources you can trust, or it's just a hell of a work to go after and do the fact checking? And another thing is there any danger that if this war fatigue strikes in, the pendulum kind of turns back, and then more people will just accuse Ukraine for the problems, and this could give ground for more Russian disinformation in many countries in Europe. What is your take on that?
This whom can you trust question is a really difficult one, but yeah, honestly, I think we will follow Michael's Twitter account, for example, and no, because but I mean this is partly, you know, this is partly a joke, but at the same time no, because this is what we have been relying on, because obviously we cannot say for sure whether a corpse was, I don't know, Russian or Ukrainian soldier on the ground when we are not on the ground, but there are some great reporters, great experts out there on the ground, really taking proof with their own eyes, and we do rely greatly on others people's work as well. For example, we are looking closely at the work of the International Fact-Checking Network organization, and as this information really travels through borders with very little modification or a little bit tailor-made to the home audience, depending on like national expectations. I don't know. Anyway, in many cases, we just see that the same type of disinformation gets machine translated to Hungarian. So if we see a reliable debunk of that information, I think that's an obligation for us to use others' work, because if we act as like individual islands in our own countries, then we wouldn't go too far with this. And on the other hand, I also feel that this very special moment in history is also a good way of, well, for us journalists or anybody who talks to the public to reflect a little bit, or not a little bit, quite a lot on our work about how we can effectively communicate with people, because in many cases we also feel the pressure that we are labeled as somebody who would want to tell people what to think and what the truth is, and how would we know the truth. No, sometimes we just have to acknowledge that we do have our limitations, and we cannot be sure about the reliability of an information, but we can actively do a lot through our work to educate people, through our articles as well, to point out what are, you know, the points of doubt, for example, when you're reading a piece of news. How do we as journalists do fact-checking? How do we do geolocation? How do we do reverse image search? Whatever. So when somebody actually reads our articles, wouldn't be obliged to believe the journalist because she or he is a very good journalist, but because he would be able to replicate our work if they want in that piece or any other piece of misinformation or alleged misinformation that they are encountering in their own lives. So I think this is the more optimistic viewpoint. It's also an opportunity for us to learn from this situation and get better at our work.
Yeah, I think the key word is education, and this is not easy. Just a little bit back to global politics, to Michael and the rest of the panel. How will the outcome of the war, you know, it can go either way, or we don't know, influence the position of the US in global politics, and what will happen to the European Union? Perhaps Michael, the US, and then András and Peter, the EU side, and then we will wrap it up.
Well, look, I think there were two comments that came from the US government at very high levels which generated quite a lot of controversy at the time. The first was Joe Biden in Poland saying that Putin cannot be allowed to remain in power. This was read as a new announcement of US strategic policy to do regime change in Russia. It was not. It was an off-the-cuff comment, as our president is wont to make, saying that, you know, this man is a war criminal and a monster, and look at how destabilizing his actions have been, not just in Ukraine, but all over the world. The GRU, Russian military intelligence, has committed acts of terrorism in England, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and that's just what we know based on reporting and what the security services of those countries have said publicly. There's still a lot of activity in the last 8 or 9 years that has yet to be disclosed publicly. the second comment was Lloyd Austin, the Defense Secretary of the United States, who said, our goal is basically to allow Ukraine to degrade Russian military capability to such an extent that they cannot wage another war of conquest like this again. And both of these comments, to me, sounded very logical, commonsensical, and moral. But you can imagine the furor in certain precincts of the American political landscape anyway. Look, if Russia wins, and frankly, what would a win look like at the moment? Clearly, the strategic objective of sacking Kyiv and eliminating Ukrainian sovereignty has failed. Full stop. That in and of itself is a massive victory for Ukraine, a massive victory for Europe, a massive victory for liberal democracy. If Putin manages to occupy and hold all of Donetsk and Lugansk and create his so-called land bridge to Crimea, okay, that's going to have dramatic international repercussions at the economic level, food, grain shortages, particularly affecting the global south, where Russia's popularity is still quite high, and the narrative, I mean, we focused perhaps a little too chauvinistically on our neck of the woods, but there's a whole other part of the world that doesn't see Russia as engaged in a genocidal campaign in Ukraine and believes a lot of what the Kremlin is saying about the origins of the conflict and the way it's been proceeding, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, look, I think it's perhaps stating it too highly to say that as goes Ukraine, so goes the United States. Clearly, I think the major factors that are going to contribute to both the midterm congressional elections and the next presidential election, more domestic politics it ever was thus. I mean, unless the United States is itself directly engaged in a very unpopular foreign war, which it is still not. The U.S. economy is paramount. The price of gas at the pump, obviously. You know, there are obviously dramatic social and cultural issues such as school massacres and this debate about gun legislation. These things will tend to have a higher bearing. The thing that I would look for, though, is to what extent is there going to be a continuity of policy if, say, this administration ceases to exist and a new one comes to power in the next election. And that, to me, is the big question mark. And, you know, as Peter and others were saying, the longer the war goes on, it's sort of a paradox. I think the battlefield dynamics favor Ukraine as the defender, with a bigger pool to recruit manpower. Clearly, they're being trained up on weapon systems. There will be a steady supply of the things that have already been provided, if not necessarily an escalation in new kit. So that favors Ukraine, but it doesn't favor international resolve to help Ukraine. People will get tired. People will say, okay, Ukraine, you've proved your point, you still exist. Why don't you start to make some kind of settlement with the Russians? In fact, you're already seeing this. The New York Times had an op-ed basically calling on Zelensky to cut a deal with Putin. I think the most important thing is, and certainly from my perspective, it is an act of imperialism to tell a country, you must do the following because it is in our economic interests and because it is inconvenient for you not to do so. Full stop. Joe Biden said in the New York Times also, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. This has got to be the kind of signature line for all U.S. policy going forward. If the Ukrainian population tomorrow, if there was a referendum, was held and they said, okay, we're exhausted, you know, we've lost too many soldiers, you know, too many civilians have died, we need to bring this war to an end and we have to do it by making a deal with Putin, fine. The United States, the European Union, NATO, duty-bound, honor-bound to execute Ukraine's wishes. But so far, they're fighting on their land for their territory. They're asking for more assistance. Their morale is still incredibly high. And the willingness for the general population to press on is still very much in the 90 percentile, which is kind of unheard of given the political fractiousness of that country. We just have to keep going, and keep going until they say otherwise.
So what's the approach of the European Union? Nothing without Ukraine, or is this a moment of truth for the EU, or this is just a more complicated issue than for the US? András?
Edith, I'm a meek Russia analyst. I don't know much about the European Union. So all I can say here is just some very small pieces of a puzzle, not necessarily of the EU, but of Europe in general. I remember 9/11. I was still a university student. And back in Hungary University, back then there was no internet. I mean, not even television. And one could just feel that something really big change is happening. Some kind of a historical moment is happening. Same feeling I have. So Europe is changing a lot in terms of foreign policy, security policy, and also defense policy. I mean, what the German leadership calls Zeitenwende, times changing, this is happening. I mean, Germany on the track of rearming herself. Just this year, 100 billion euros extra. Germany will reach the 2% GDP on defense, something other NATO allies have been pushing for years. Now, already after the recognition of DNR and LNR, so the two separatist entities, Germany pledged that, okay, we do the 2%. Poland is going to increase its defense spendings from 2% to 3%. Many other European countries are also boosting up their armament programs, increasing their defense spendings. Europe is rearming herself, finally. After 2014, this started, but the process was slow. But after 24th of February this year, I mean, such things have been said which were unimaginable even half a year ago. I mean, former German President Steinmeier saying that I was wrong. We misunderstood Russia. I'm not sure we still understand Russia well or perfectly or properly. Probably even Russians don't do it. But now this Zeitenwende is really taking place. And this is, you use the metaphor of a pendulum. These changes take time. And now the pendulum is swinging towards Europe rearming herself. I don't think this is going to change overnight. So this is a trend we are going to see in the upcoming years. My guess is that this will take the better part of this decade. So Europe again militarizing herself, Swedes and Finns joining NATO, something which has been unimaginable for decades. And this just happened like this. Two societies decided to join a military alliance without a referendum. Could you imagine this happening? Now it did. A lot of things are happening. Could you imagine Western or Balkans NATO allies banning the aircraft of Sergei Lavrov from flying over? Could you imagine this ever happening? I couldn't. And personally, I love it as a masterful piece of trolling. But still, a lot of such things are happening which were absolutely off even from the widest imagination half a year ago. So I think this is where we are heading, and I don't have the illusion that I would know all pieces of the puzzle.
So Peter, finally, is this the paradox that Putin is actually uniting Europe?
Yes, I think pretty much this is happening. So I mean, I participated in tons of discussions in Brussels and elsewhere on the identity of European Union and what will make the European Union and let's say an efficient body in terms of geopolitics. Ursula von der Leyen have told at the very beginning that her commission will be a geopolitical commission, but it was rather an empty promise, and these were empty talks. And right now, yeah, this is just happening. The Commission and the whole European Union have become a geopolitical entity. And yeah, I totally agree with András that I think we can still criticize the pace of, let's say, weapon supplies from France, from Germany to Ukraine and so on. But I think in many sense a big part of the European mainstream that was about to establish stronger economic relations with Russia to make itself more independent from the United States have overstepped their shadows. And so did the, let's say, German Greens, so did the German Social Democrats to a certain extent. And yeah, I mean, the picture is not black and white, but I think it's what is happening in Europe is huge, and yes, from Hungary it's easier to see the disagreements, but it's one member state just can't change the history. And even if it's not just one member state, but in many issues, of course, there are, let's say, more silent allies for a softer approach. But in the times when Slovakia is sending weapons bilaterally to Ukraine, when Bulgaria have closed their airspace over the airplane of the Russian foreign minister. So yeah, I totally agree that what is happening is absolutely historic, and also the steps towards a greater energy independence, I think, are extremely important. Again, I don't think it is so easy to reverse this willingness, and in countries like Austria, that has traditionally never been really hawkish. I mean, citizens are competing with each other who can use less energy to save more Ukrainian lives. And what I think what is happening is really historic in this sense. And as András and Michael told as well, the EU and NATO, I think, are becoming just more attractive. So Putin did the favor for the leaders of the democratic world to show the real nature of an autocracy, of a real dictatorship, and this is the point where I think the Western alliances can crystallize their values.
Thank you very much. So on this optimistic note, we will close the panel discussion and open up for questions in the audience. Please identify yourself and ask a question. Please, no comments this time. Can we have a microphone? Yes. The gentleman over there.
So, my name is Georg Ladani, a freelance person, and I have my first question to Michael. And I like to know, so what is your most individual and private opinion about the shifting of the goal of the Russians? Is it only up to their rogue ruler? And in case, you think, did this goal change since the beginning of this invasion or this aggression? Could this change with the time? Or he's just stubborn and really focused of his goal to destroy and demolish a statehood of the independent Ukraine? Could he change his mind? What is your most private and individual idea of the goal of the Russians and of nobody else but them?
So, I mean, it's as difficult as it is to do Kremlinology in 2022, it's incredibly difficult to do Putinology. Look, I mean, I can tell you this. At the start of the war, I was getting messages coming from Russian security services, other sources in Russia, that this is a complete and utter disaster of a policy. Why is he doing this? It is going to backfire catastrophically on Russia. I did a story a few weeks ago. You've seen that all of these rumors, which are being mostly laundered through the tabloid presses in the UK and now in the United States about Putin's health. He's got Parkinson's disease, he's got cancer, he certainly looks sick. If you watch the image of him at Victory Day, puffy face, wearing a blanket when the weather wasn't all that cold and all this stuff. And the reason I did the story was I had an audio recording of an oligarch whose identity I confirmed, basically telling a Western financier, he spent 11 minutes, 10 of which were about how disastrous this war is, and Putin has lost his mind, and he is in the space of, you know, at this point it was only a few weeks into the war, a few weeks, and he has rolled back 20 years of what we have done for Russia in terms of influence peddling, making this a globally integrated economy, seconding Western elites to the point almost of state capture. Particularly in Germany, and using economic leverage, using energy security, all of that has now been torn asunder. And oh, by the way, you know, he's a dying animal. He has blood cancer. Now, I don't know if Vladimir Putin has blood cancer or if he is a dying animal, but I do find it very interesting that people who are on paper billionaires and are, as all oligarchs are, to make the proper definition of the term, plenipotentiaries of the regime, that they're going around telling Westerners this. My perception is there's a great deal of discontent at very high levels in the Russian government, the military-industrial complex, to be sure, the security services, to be sure, about this war. They think it's a calamity. They think it's going to lead to regime change in Russia one way or another. There's also a lot of speculation about attempts to try and isolate Putin, if not do a coup. Not going to weigh in on any of that. But in terms of what's in his mind, all I can say is what is playing out on the battlefield. The battle for Kyiv ended decisively in Ukraine's favor. There's no question that the Russians suffered immense losses to the point where they had to withdraw from Kyiv Oblast. They've also now, basically, the Kharkiv front has collapsed. Now the so-called goal or strategic objective is this sort of horseshoe in Donbass and capturing the southeastern littoral to create this land bridge to Crimea. Will they make a play for Odessa? I didn't think they could mount an amphibious assault on Odessa even before the Moskva was sank, much less can they do so now with a coastal defense system that's being provided by the West. Now the question is, will Putin carve up enough territory in Donbass and in Donetsk and Lugansk such that he feels confident and emboldened enough to try and make another play for Kyiv? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think he even knows the answer to that. I think he is being misled about the course of this war. I think he certainly believes his own propaganda. Even going back to 2014, I remember interviewing Mustafa Zhemilev, the Crimean Tatar leader and Soviet dissident, who had a call with Putin after the annexation of Crimea, in which he said Putin just kept telling him, fascists have taken over Kiev, fascists have taken over Kiev, I need to do this to protect ethnic Russians. Now, was this him just giving the party line to Mustafa Zhemilev, or was this basically the Russian state created a narrative, and it has been so forcefully pushed and propounded that the president of Russia now believes his own nonsense? I don't know. I don't know the state of his mental health. I don't know the state of you know, is this kind of the meme from the movie Downfall where Hitler is in the bunker, you know, screaming at his generals? Certainly when you have lost 14 flag officers in the space of less than 4 months, 14 generals now, I think have been confirmed killed in this war. That is unsustainable. That is unprecedented. I defer to military experts on the manpower capability, the firepower capability, you know, bringing up reserves. But you're also seeing now in the Russian population, and it's difficult to get credible information because of the lockdown on media, but clearly people simply don't want to go to the front. You know, contract soldiers saying, "Take me to court. I'd much rather take my chances in even a Russian court than be sent to this meat grinder conflict. And oh, by the way, you can't put me in jail for treason because we're not in an active state of war. I just signed a contract." So they're engaging in civil lawsuit to avoid being sent. Things are not going well for him, writ large. And that has to, we cannot lose sight of that, right? We do the daily tick-tock of, you know, this village or this town has changed hands X number of times. The big perspective is he lost what he wanted, and he has to continue to lose what he wants.
Any other questions? Yes, the gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Pablo. First of all, I want to thank your American partners and European partners for your support, and for Hungarian also, at least for public transportation, for free public transportation tickets. My question, according to our long history with Russia, I would take for 300 years. This action right now, this war, is just repetitive action. So Tsars, next leaders, Russian leaders, communist leaders, Soviet Union, is just repetitive action because every, like 50 years, some cycle, historical cycle, we have some clashes. Small clashes, big clashes. Our Cossacks, Ukrainian Cossacks in 17th century killed Russian soldiers when they raped our Ukrainian women in our villages. So reading the history, I see the same repetitive actions. Right now, I see just the same war, the same conflict, but with huge artillery, with tanks, with people, with soldiers. Even they lose 14 generals. Who cares in the war? I mean, it's just numbers. We also lose soldiers. So my question, to win this fight, I mean, not just simply killing soldiers, because it doesn't matter, 1, 2 soldiers. We and the rest of the world who supports us, I think, should see what's the next for us in this schedule. I mean, not just push forces, Russian forces to the border and just stay there. Because if, according to history, Russia will, as Russia exists in this world, Russia will act aggressively against Ukraine, at least Ukraine. So I think the Western world has to have some idea what to do next with Russia, to destroy, kill, I mean, to divide Russia by small states. I mean, what's the next steps? Because our forces hopefully will push, maybe not push, because my forecast, it's not kind of very successful. We can stop, but also we have to know that to push forces back, we have to have at least 5 or 7 more times more soldiers than we do right now. So it's just numbers. When you see it numbers, you can predict your capability. So my question, does bureaucracy and Western elites have this plan to do what to do with Russia? And if they have this plan, if this democracy is ready to destroy Russia or to do what is Russia? So my question about this.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
how to prevent Russia to strike back? András?
If I knew, right? And if I knew, I would never get a visa again to Russia. Okay, putting jokes aside, this is how empires work. Do you know how, since when the Russian Empire has been expansive? You do it. Others, how many centuries? Since Ivan III. More than 500 years of expansionism. This is how empires work. There is no way to change how empires work. But I think, and in the historical perspective, who am I to tell how to change an empire working? But when this war will be over, Ukraine will survive, and it's very important what was said. Ukraine defied Russia's initial plans. Ukraine will exist as an independent, functioning state. Damaged, bled out, shattered, but alive. So that's one very important thing. And second, Russia is suffering serious losses. It's not only about military manpower. Also in terms of military manpower, they are suffering serious losses. I'm among the nerds who are counting, soldiers and losses. After the battle for Donbass is over, the Russian military will be a spent force. There is no way they could go for Odessa. There is no way they could go again for Kiev, unless they go for a full-scale mobilization, which they won't do for domestic political reasons. So after the Battle of Donbass will be over, we are going to see a decrease of intensity of fighting. But it's not the military losses which are weakening Russia. It's not only the military losses. It's not even the sanctions themselves. It's the technology. Because the oligarch was right. And I have a guess about the person, but it doesn't matter. The oligarch was right. Russia is losing 30 years of development. Russia is now fighting herself back to the early 1990s. Dear colleagues, their military industry is so much dependent on Western technology. Western including Japanese optics for their tanks. Both major Russian tank factories are on halt because they don't have the optics for their tanks. They are so dependent on Western technology that they will have serious problems even replacing the losses they are suffering now. Not to mention continuing the rearmament program. In the industries is getting downgraded, business environment is shattered. Look at particularly what's happening in air traffic. So we are going to have a really weak, isolated Russia losing 30 years of development. And what we're going to have on the Ukrainian side? We are going to have a Ukraine bled out, shattered, damaged, but victorious and armed to the teeth. We will have a heavily armed Ukraine with 8 or 9 years of war fighting experience of Russia, and if the experience of surviving for fighting against Russia for 8-9 years. Ukraine's own military power is going to be the guarantee that this is not going to get repeated anytime soon. I mean, Russia will have really serious problem even replenishing its own losses. Each and every Kamov helicopter that comes down, it will not be replaced because they cannot produce the parts necessary. The same with the tanks. The tanks use French-made sensors. They're not going to get those sensors anymore. Everything that burns out on the battlefield is off for good. So Ukraine's military capabilities and the willingness to fight, this will be the most important guarantee for any kind of post-Putin Russia not repeating this offensive anytime soon. That's it.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, perhaps the last one.
Thank you. I am Peter Csunderlik, historian. And I would ask, what do you think about the role Boris Johnson PM has played in this conflict? Because he catched the opportunity and tried to escape from his coronavirus scandal via jumping into war diplomacy, and he pretends himself as a new Churchill. And I think it is a bit paradox because after Great Britain had left European Union, now Great Britain became maybe the most active European country in building a supportive coalition behind Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Who would like to take that? Michael?
So I'm also a citizen of the Republic of Ireland, which probably makes me the closest to, I shouldn't say this in Ireland, but the closest to a UK citizen or, to the political establishment there. So I'm happy to take the question. Look, I was not, and I am not, an admirer of Boris Johnson or his politics. And I agree there's a bit of a look over here but not over there aspect to his security policy with respect to Ukraine. But all I can tell you is Ukrainians love him and absolutely love the United Kingdom. And the United States and the UK, as I mentioned earlier, there is a very long and established and implacable relationship, the special relationship between these two countries, particularly at the intelligence sharing capability, which has no bearing on who occupies 10 Downing Street or who occupies Pennsylvania Avenue. And in respect of this, if Boris Johnson wants to dress up as Winston Churchill, and sort of broadcast to the British electorate that this is his finest hour and this is Britain's finest hour, even in light of Brexit, which I consider to be disastrous policy for the UK, but also for the European Union and for the transatlantic relationship, because the Americans like the UK in the EU, because they're our closest ally, and they can help shape EU policy, which would be especially helpful now, given that France and Germany are behaving like France and Germany. I have no problem with that. And it's very interesting. The United States announced the supply of HIMARS, which are mobile multiple launch rocket systems, to Ukraine. This was a very contentious issue in the United States, because these rockets, depending on the kind of munition that you supply them with, can have a range of 50 miles or 150 miles. So this finally got done, and it was announced and reported in CNN, and then President Biden had to write a New York Times op-ed justifying this decision and saying, we're not trying to go to war with Russia. The very next day, Boris Johnson announced, we'll do them one better and provide them with GMLRS systems, which are even more powerful than the American. And in order to get this signed, because there's an end-user agreement, the United States supplied the UK with these systems, the US had to consent. And wouldn't you know it, within 24 hours of that decision, the United States said, happy hunting. So there is an integral relationship between America and the UK. And with respect to Ukraine, I mean, look, he survived a no-confidence vote. I have no idea if he's going to be in power in 6 months. I don't really care, because the leader of the opposition in the UK is just as good on Ukraine, Keir Starmer. The Labour Party has finally got a credible leader who could win an election. Great. This is domestic UK politics. But with respect to international affairs, you ask any Ukrainian, they have no problems with Boris Johnson. It was very significant, I think, that he was, I believe, the first Western leader to arrive in Kyiv after the EU delegation. This was days after I had left Kyiv, so I remember it quite clearly. He did that sort of promenade stroll with President Zelensky. It's very powerful. And if he's motivated by cynical or venal motives, well, so what? I care about the material result.
Thank you very much. Very last question.
Hello everyone, thanks for your support. I'm from Ukraine, and the first question is is enough support that all countries are giving for Ukraine, and now for your all opinion. And second question, what you and all people here can do to contact with decision makers in your countries, like deputies or senators, or maybe big charity funds or some foundations, because I have many contacts with volunteers. They have huge decline of help. So Ukrainian people, we gave all money, but it's going down. And for myself, also going a lot of money, but it's declining. We have our support. So we need more support, not only from government, we need support from institutions, and how it's programmed, how it's coordinated. and maybe you have some contacts. We can do like also fundraising. I do charities, Rotary Club. So that's this contact, this meeting should be something, something in general, something impact for this. So what is your ideas, not for all speakers, maybe for people who are here? Thank you very much.
Peter, perhaps fundraising, what can we do? What can be done?
Wish I knew. Yeah, I'm not satisfied with already with what most of the EU countries deliver for Ukraine. And especially if we take a look at the weapons supplies, yeah, the gap between US, UK, and the rest of the world is just striking. So it's compared to them, what Europe is giving, as far as I can judge, but András is the military expert, not me, is minuscule. But so I would be happier with more support, even if, as I told, I think what has happened already in the EU is something historic. I would be happier with more support of the civil society as well, here in Hungary and elsewhere in Europe. Also, I think what we as a think tank can do is to organize discussions and go to the media and talk about the importance of this issue. And yeah, I think anyone who has some impact in their environment and on the society and in the public domain should keep talking about the issues. So that's how to fundraise. I mean, the reason why it's hard to tell, especially here in Hungary, is that I'm sometimes feel, and there is this, and it will be really, I mean, it won't be a normative statement, but it will be a descriptive statement. So people sometimes have the tendency to turn away when they see horrible things, and I mean, the literature of the reception of the Holocaust trauma in the societies, in German societies, for example, prove as well that sometimes when people should feel some kind of guilt, they rather say that, okay, that's not my story, and turn away. So how to overcome that? I'm not sure that. While I do think that talking more and more about the victims is a morally good thing. I'm not totally convinced, for example, that for pure communication purposes, it's the right thing. I think that probably the best message right now for the Hungarian, probably the European electorate as well, and audience is that, yeah, don't team up with the losers. So Russia is going to lose this war big time if we take a look at their original goals and the gap between that, and yeah, the more support for Ukraine, yeah, the more victory for the West and for the Western alliances. But as I said again, I'm not a fundraiser by my original expertise. So maybe some others in the room have a better idea about that, or anyone in the panel.
Thank you. Two short things. When it comes to the actual military assistance, there is a thing called absorption capability. You cannot pour all types of military hardware on a foreign army all at once. It requires training, it requires a lot of logistics. With providing the M777, it's a howitzer, it's relatively easy to train. To provide, let's say, a much more complex system, the German-made Panzerhaubitze 2000, you require more training. So there is a lot of logistics and military science in what pace, what speed you can provide assistance. Could have been faster, sure, but a lot of things are coming, and a lot more things will come. So this is, it will take a few more weeks until long-range Western artillery shows up in Ukraine in much larger numbers. So in a few weeks, we will see quite some difference when it comes to long-range artillery strikes. And that will help Ukraine's army a lot. Not necessarily to win back territory, and I fully agree, but to hold up the Russian advance. So a few more weeks. Some of the systems are already in the battlefield. Some of the systems are already in Ukraine, just not yet deployed to the front line. A lot more is coming, really just a few weeks. And when it comes to fundraising, I mean, I'm not tasked to say anything publicly about Hungary, so I won't. But I find the Lithuanian example breathtaking. Of raising publicly money for a Bayraktar drone, what, 3 days? I mean, just public campaign for not just generally support Ukraine, but to buy something particular, buy a drone. So if I were to design fundraising campaigns, and of course each and every society is different, but I could ask my friend in Lithuania, how did you do that? Because this is something that could be done perhaps in other societies as well. Not just ask for help in general or help suffering Ukrainian children. No, help buy a drone. Something particular. It's easier to donate for something particular. So this is something that probably could be learned from our Lithuanian friends, but that's just an idea.
Yeah, and there's also, keep in mind, Western security assistance that gets reported on, creates a scandal, and then all of a sudden it gets hushed up, but it doesn't mean that the systems haven't been delivered. So early in the war, there was this call for MiG-29s, and you'll remember Joseph Borrell gave a press conference in which he said, the EU will provide fighter jets. Everybody stopped in their tracks. What do you mean? I did some reporting on this, and I know what had happened, which was basically the Polish cabinet had agreed to do this, but to do it clandestinely. Somebody in the Polish cabinet went around bragging that we're about to give 20 or whatever MiG-29s to Ukraine. It became an international scandal. However, you'll notice, and this wasn't as reported recently, but it did happen, Ukraine has been delivered, I think, 20 MiG-29s as well as Su-25s. However, how were they delivered? They were disassembled somewhere in Europe and turned into, quote, spare parts, and have been reassembled in Ukraine. So fighter jets have been delivered to Ukraine. It just didn't make A1 of the New York Times. And the question is, which countries did this? I have my suspicions that it's probably Poland and Slovakia, but that's neither here nor there. The bottom line is the Ukrainian Air Force was replenished, but nobody was talking about it. So there's still a lot of things going on behind the scenes. And yes, to your point about the Bayraktar drone, look, one of the things that I noticed in 2014 when Ukraine's military was in a very bad state, the political establishment was in an even worse state, was, and this kind of helped me build a sense of optimism and confidence in Ukraine's just overall capability. Ukrainian civil society was the real heartbeat of the country and was doing things for Euromaidan and then also for the war effort that simply the state could not do because it didn't have the resources or the knowledge or the capability. This remains the case, Ukrainian civil society. One of the reasons I tell whoever wants to listen that forget about NATO membership for the time being. You don't need it. EU membership is the more important thing because the political, social, and economic benefits that derive therefrom will greatly enhance Ukraine's capability to, as my friend here said, reconstruct a shattered but victorious nation. But more to the point, all of the IT specialist engineers that have basically allowed Ukraine to win this war so far, I mean, extraordinary things have happened. They're taking hobby drones that can be purchased off Amazon, World War II mortars, 3D printing fins for the mortars and dropping the mortars with such precision they go through the sunroof of a Russian vehicle and blow the whole thing up, right? All of these things are to the net benefit of the European community and European society, right, writ large. I fully agree what the Lithuanians have done is remarkable, and keep in mind, the Turkish drone company was given the €5+ million and said, you know what, we're going to gift the Bayraktar drone to Ukraine, and we'll use the €5 million for humanitarian assistance. You've maybe been following the controversy about Sweden, especially more so than Finland, and its membership in NATO and how Turkey is holding this up. I told the Swedes, and I wasn't kidding, why don't you just announce that one of your IKEA factories is going to be a Bayraktar drone factory, and you're going to manufacture drones expressly for the purpose of supplying the Ukrainians, and see how that goes down with President Erdogan, because I suspect it would actually make a difference. And this is something that civil society can do in a way that government simply cannot, because every ordinary citizen of a country can raise a fuss, whereas if you're a government minister, you cannot necessarily.
Thank you very much. We are at the end of our time. Thank you very much for the panelists, for their thoughts, for their remarks, and for your patience and excellent questions. Thank you very much for being with us. I think there is some coffee and cake in the background, so we can continue our discussions if you still have some time to spend with us. Thanks and goodbye. Have a nice afternoon.